Number 10, Zarange in Sistan, 1383. In autumn 1383, Timur was 47 years old, newly master of Samarkand, and looking east. The region of Sistan sat on the edge of what is now Afghanistan and Iran, and its capital, Zarange, sometimes called Shar-i-Sistan, sat on a river network that made it one of the richest agricultural regions in the medieval world. The Malik of Sistan, a man named Qutb al-Din of the Mirabanid dynasty, had already tried to buy Timur off. He had sent his relative, Taj al-Din Shah Jahan, to Timur's camp with tribute, and Shah Jahan had made such a good impression that Timur let him return home. It should have been enough. It wasn't. In November 1383, Timur crossed into Sistan with an army and made a demand the Malik could not accept. The Mirabanid forces marched out to fight, and they were destroyed in a single battle outside the city walls. Contemporary chronicles say Timur's soldiers built a pyramid of human skulls out of the slain defenders right there on the battlefield before the city had even fallen. This was Timur telling Zarange what was coming. Then he broke into the city itself. Qutb al-Din was captured alive. Timur, in what looked like an act of mercy, appointed Shah Jahan, the man he had liked at his camp, as the new governor of Sistan. The condition was that Shah Jahan had to convince the defenders still holding the citadel to surrender. Timur promised he would spare them if they laid down their arms. Shah Jahan went to the walls and negotiated. The defenders believed him. They opened the citadel gates. What followed was a 3-day massacre. Timur did not spare them. He never intended to. The citizens of Zarange were butchered in the streets in their homes, in the Great Mosque, and then Timur did something even the Mongols, under Genghis Khan, had never done. He ordered around 2,000 of his surviving prisoners to be built alive into a tower, not killed and then stacked. Alive, mixed with wet clay and stone, packed into the shape of a minaret while they were still breathing, still screaming. Chroniclers wrote that the sound could be heard for miles as the mortar dried. When it was over, Zarange had ceased to exist as a functioning city. Timur's army moved on and systematically destroyed the surrounding countryside. They burned the dams that fed Sistan's irrigation canals, the same canals that had made the region flower for 1,000 years. The dams did not just water crops. They controlled the flow of an entire river system. Once broken, they could not easily be rebuilt. The green heart of Sistan turned to desert within a generation and is never fully recovered. Shah-i-Jahan inherited the throne of a kingdom that no longer existed. His people were dead. His fields were sand. His capital was a memory with a tower of screaming men baked into its center. This was Timur's opening statement to the world. Genghis Khan, at his most brutal, had killed men and then counted heads. Timur wanted heads that could talk, heads that could feel their own murder happening around them. The tower at Zarange was not just a monument. It was a policy document. It said, "Do not fight me. If you fight me, I will not simply kill you. I will make your death into an object my next enemy has to look at." And for the next 22 years, cities across Asia would look at what Timur had done at Zarange and calculate whether resistance was worth it. Many decided it wasn't. That was the entire point. Number 9, Isfahan, 1387. 4 years later, Timur reached Isfahan, one of the great cities of the Persian world. Isfahan did not fight him. The city's leaders, remembering Zarange, opened their gates and formally surrendered. Timur accepted. He installed a garrison of about 3,000 soldiers, imposed a heavy tax, and moved on to besiege Shiraz. This should have been the end of Isfahan's story. It wasn't. Timur's tax collectors were rough men. They demanded payment that some of the city's poorer districts simply could not produce. And on a night in November 1387, a blacksmith named Ali Kuchapa reportedly beat his drum in the alleyways of Isfahan, and the city rose in revolt. By dawn, all 3,000 of Timur's garrison were dead, every single soldier he had left behind. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, their weapons were seized, the tax collectors were murdered in their beds. Isfahan had done something almost no city ever did to Timur. It had killed his men after formally surrendering. Timur turned his army around. When he arrived at Isfahan's walls, he did not even bother with a proper siege. The city, which had already surrendered once, had no fight left. He simply walked back in, and then he ordered his soldiers to bring him heads. Each unit was given a quota. The Persian troops in Timur's army, some of them recruited from Isfahan's rival cities, could not stomach the killing, and reportedly began buying heads from the more willing units at 20 dinars each. By the second day, the price had dropped to half a dinar. By the third day, it did not matter. There were no more heads to buy. The final total, according to the eyewitness historian Hafiz Ayabru, who walked the ruined city afterward, was around 70,000 severed heads. He counted them. He also counted the towers they were stacked into. There were 28 towers on either side of the roads leading in and out of Isfahan, each averaging roughly 1,500 skulls. Some sources give even higher numbers, as many as 200,000 dead, though modern historians tend toward the lower figure. The towers were not random piles. Timur had them constructed with deliberate architectural intent, geometric, symmetrical, tall enough that a rider could see them from a long way off. The chronicler Ahmed ibn Arab Shah, who hated Timur but reported accurately described the pyramids as minarets of skulls. Merchants coming down the road toward Isfahan for years afterward would see them first, before they saw the city itself. This was the strategy. The towers were an advertisement. Timur was not building them for himself. He was building them for the next city he had not yet reached. The one whose leaders would hear about Isfahan and calculate that surrender, even qualified surrender, even negotiated surrender, was safer than resistance. He spared the artisans. He always spared the artisans. Isfahan's calligraphers, tile makers, weavers, and metalworkers were rounded up and marched east to Samarkand, where they were forced to build the palaces and mosques that still stand today. The Bibi Khana Mosque in Samarkand has bricks laid by men whose neighbors' heads formed the minarets of Isfahan. Timur did not just kill a city, he extracted its talent, killed everyone else, and used the killing to intimidate the next city. That is the difference between him and Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan destroyed Timur-curated destruction. Isfahan is the first great example of a Timurid signature. A city that could have been left alone, forever punished for a single night's uprising, with 70,000 heads stacked into 28 towers so that other cities would remember. And they did. Number 8, the Kondurcha River, 1391. Now we leave the world of Persian cities and step into something even more astonishing. In 1391, Timur set out to do something no army in history had ever done successfully. He marched more than 1,000 kilometers across empty steppe to fight an enemy who thought he could not possibly find them. The enemy was Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, ruler of the Mongol successor state that stretched across the Russian steppes from the Volga to the Black Sea. Toktamish was Timur's protege. Years earlier, Timur had personally installed him on the throne of the White Horde, giving him men, horses, and money. Toktamish had used those gifts to unite the Golden Horde, sack Moscow, and rebuild Mongol power in Eastern Europe. And then he had turned on the man who made him. He invaded Azerbaijan, which Timur considered his own territory. He raided into Transoxiana, briefly threatening Samarkand itself. He was, in Timur's eyes, an ungrateful pupil who needed to be taught a final lesson. But finding Toktamish was not simple. The Golden Horde was a nomadic empire. Its army did not defend cities because it had few worth defending. If Timur marched north into the steppe, Toktamish could simply retreat further. The steppe was enormous, empty for weeks in any direction. A place where an army could starve to death chasing shadows. Timur assembled 100,000 men in early 1391 and marched them north from Samarkand. The route he chose has staggered military historians ever since. He crossed the Sirdarya, then the deserts north of the Aral Sea, then the empty grasslands of what is now western Kazakhstan and the southern Ural region. For weeks, his men saw no living thing except their own horses. There were no cities to loot, no farms to raid, no villages to burn for supplies. Timur solved this by turning his soldiers into hunters. He staged massive circle hunts, thousands of men closing on a huge stretch of steppe from all sides, driving every deer, antelope, and gazelle inside toward the center to be slaughtered en masse. His army ate what it killed. This alone was a logistical miracle. Modern armies with trucks and refrigeration could not do what Timur did with saddlebags and grass. When his men grew depressed and mutinous, Timur staged a review of the whole army on a high hill, made speeches, ordered new banners raised, and had the mullahs read prayers over them. Then he made them keep walking. Toktamish, thousands of kilometers away, kept getting reports from his scouts. Timur is coming. Timur is closer. Timur is here. He could not believe it. No one had done this to the steppe before. On June 18th, 1391, near the Kondurcha River, in what is now Russia's Samara region, Toktamish finally turned and made a stand with an army that was probably twice as large as Timur's, somewhere between 180,000 and 300,000 men. Timur was ready. He had drawn the Golden Horde into a battle at a place of his choosing after a march that had already broken every calculation Toktamish had made about him. When the battle began, Toktamish's cavalry tried the classic steppe maneuver, sweeping wide around Timur's flanks to encircle him. Timur's army held. His central formations, drilled for years in exactly this kind of assault, absorbed the wings without breaking. Then Timur launched a sudden frontal charge that ripped through the Golden Horde's center. The Horde's discipline shattered. Roughly 100,000 of Toktamish's soldiers were killed. Toktamish himself escaped into the northern forests with a bodyguard. The steppe, which had been Mongol military property for a century and a half, had just been humiliated by an army that came from a place the Mongols didn't consider a threat anymore. Timur did not massacre civilians here. There were no cities to burn. But the brutality of the Kondurcha campaign lies in what it required. Timur had proved that any place on earth, no matter how far, no matter how empty, could be reached by his army. He had proved that distance itself was no protection. The bloodline of Genghis Khan, still ruling the western steppes 165 years after their founder's death, had just been defeated by a man who wasn't even truly a Chinggisid. And Toktamish, watching his army evaporate around him, understood something. He was going to have to do this again because Timur wasn't finished. And when Timur was finished, there was going to be nothing left. Number 7, the Terek River, 1395. Toktamish had 4 years to rebuild. He raised a new army, made new alliances, drew in warriors from the Alans, the Circassians, the Zichians, the Simsim, all the peoples of the North Caucasus and the Western Steppes. He tried again in 1395. He invaded the South Caucasus, aiming to seize Azerbaijan for good. Timur, who was campaigning in the west, turned north to meet him. They met on the Terek River on April 14, 1395. This time, there was no long march required, no logistical miracle, just 2 armies of veterans, both of whom knew what was at stake, both of whom knew this fight was going to decide the fate of the Eurasian steppe forever. The battle at the Terek was brutal, close, and for hours in doubt. Toktamish's cavalry hammered Timur's right flank and center, and there was a moment when Timur's own bodyguard had to fight in his defense as the Horde's warriors reached his standard. Then something happened that would define the day. A senior Golden Horde emir named Aktau, either bribed by Timur or convinced the battle was lost, simply left the field with thousands of his warriors. Other emirs followed his example. The Horde's left flank began to peel away. Timur, who had a bloody sixth sense for exactly this kind of moment, threw everything he had at the widening gap. The Horde broke. Toktamish escaped again, but this time his army did not. And now came the real work. Timur had beaten Toktamish twice. He had decided he would not fight him a third time. So he set out to make sure the Golden Horde could not exist as a state ever again. This is where the Terek campaign turns from a battle into something historians have been trying to fully calculate for 600 years. Timur marched his army north into the heart of the Horde's territory and began erasing it. He took Astrakhan, the great trading city on the lower Volga, and burned it to the ground in the middle of winter. He took Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital city, one of the greatest urban centers of the northern Eurasian world, a city of 100,000 people with palaces and mosques and Chinese ceramics traded in its markets. He burned it. Not damaged, not looted. Burned so completely that archaeologists today have trouble finding it. He took Azov and destroyed it. He took Majar, the great trading city of the northern Caucasus, and destroyed it. He went into the Alan territories and slaughtered systematically. He crossed into Russian lands and occupied Yelets before turning south again. He did not do this because he wanted the territory. He didn't want it. He would abandon it as soon as he was done. He did it because the Golden Horde was rich for one reason. The Silk Road ran through its cities on the northern branch, the branch that fed Europe, If Sarai and Astrakhan and Azov were gone, that branch of the road was dead. The trade would rot. The tax revenue would collapse. The horde would no longer be able to feed the professional army that had terrorized Russia for 150 years. That is exactly what happened. The Golden Horde never recovered. Moscow, which had paid tribute to the Mongols for generations, watched the horde crumble, and within a century, the descendants of the men who had bowed to Toktamish were the ones collecting tribute from what remained. Timur, having killed an empire without meaning to, turned around and went home to plan his next war. That war would be against India. Number 6. Delhi, 1398. In 1398, Timur was 62 years old, and he was looking at India. Officially, his justification was religious. The Delhi Sultanate, which was Muslim, had, in his opinion, been too tolerant of the Hindu majority. He needed to correct this. Unofficially, everyone, including his own emirs, knew the real reason. India was rich. Delhi, in the 14th century, was one of the great cities of the world, its bazaars full of gold, its treasuries full of centuries of accumulated tribute from conquered Hindu kingdoms. Timur wanted it. He crossed the Indus River on September 24, 1398, with an army of about 90,000 cavalry. What followed was a march of atrocity through northern India. He sacked Multan. He butchered the Rajput garrison at Bhatner. He burned villages the length of his advance so that any survivors would not be able to organize against him. And he took prisoners. He took a lot of prisoners. By early December, as he approached Delhi, Timur's army had gathered roughly 100,000 Hindu captives. They were being marched south. With the invasion, they were being used as forced labor and as human shields. Then, on December 12th, an intelligence report came in that would decide the fate of every one of those prisoners. Timur's scouts told him that during a skirmish with Delhi's forces, some of the enslaved captives had cheered when they saw Timur's men taking casualties. Timur understood immediately what this meant. If he took his army into a full battle with Delhi's sultan, while 100,000 hostile prisoners were sitting behind his lines, they would rise. His whole army could be destroyed from within. His response has become one of the most infamous single orders ever given in military history. He ordered that every single prisoner be executed. Not most, not the young men. Every single one. Around 100,000 Hindu prisoners were killed in a single afternoon at Loni, just outside Delhi. The Zafarnama, the official chronicle written for Timur's own court, describes the massacre without apology. Each of Timur's soldiers was assigned a share of the prisoners and made personally responsible for killing them. Even the mullahs and scholars accompanying the army were ordered to kill their assigned share. The chronicle notes that one of Timur's most learned advisors, a mild scholar who had never harmed anyone, personally executed 15 Hindus that day. This was Timur's method of guaranteeing complicity. He wanted no one in the army who could claim clean hands. The next day, December 17th, 1398, Timur fought Sultan Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud Shah Tughlaq outside the walls of Delhi. The Sultan's army was formidable in one respect. He had 120 war elephants, each armored in chainmail, each with poisoned blades attached to its tusks. Timur's steppe cavalry had never faced war elephants before. His own men were afraid. So Timur invented a solution on the spot that is still studied at military academies today. He ordered his engineers to dig deep trenches in front of his cavalry positions. He scattered iron caltrops in front of the trenches, small metal spikes designed to lame elephant feet. And then he ordered his soldiers to load hundreds of camels with dry hay and firewood. When the Sultan's war elephants advanced, Timur set the camels on fire and drove them straight toward the elephants. The camels, screaming and burning, ran directly into the elephant lines. The elephants, terrified beyond any command, turned around and stampeded straight back through the Sultan's own infantry. The Delhi army collapsed under the feet of its own war beasts. Timur's cavalry finished what the elephants had started. The battle was over in a few hours. Delhi was open. The Sultan and his chief commander, Malu Iqbal, fled that night. When Timur entered Delhi on December 18th, he initially promised amnesty. It lasted 2 days. When his soldiers began looting and molesting women, the citizens fought back. Timur's response was total. For 5 days, his army methodically murdered Delhi's population. When it was over, the streets were filled with bodies so thickly that Timur's chroniclers wrote that they smelled the decomposition from miles away. The Zafarnama describes towers of skulls built at the city gates following the pattern of Isfahan. The Chronicle Ibn Arab Shah, who had no reason to protect Timur's reputation, said the city stank of death for months. Timur took the artisans, the goldsmiths, the stonemasons, and the weavers back to Samarkand. Everyone else who had not fled was either dead or enslaved. Delhi, one of the great cities of the medieval world, did not recover for over a century. Britannica notes that although the Delhi Sultanate survived on paper until 1526, it never again wielded its former power. Timur had come, killed a city, and left with 90 war elephants and an emperor's ransom in gold. He put a puppet governor in place and rode back to Samarkand. In his mind, he was still just getting started. Number 5, Aleppo, 1400. By 1400, Timur was 64 years old and had turned his attention to Mamluk Syria. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was one of the great Muslim powers of the age, the state that had famously defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and had ruled Syria and Egypt for 140 years. Timur had scores to settle. Their sultan had executed his ambassador. Their governor of Damascus had insulted him. And so, in late October 1400, Timur's army appeared outside the walls of Aleppo, the great Mamluk city of northern Syria. Aleppo's governor, a man named Tamdardash, had assembled a strong Mamluk garrison. He also had reinforcements from Tripoli under the regent al-Muayyad Sheikh and from other Syrian provinces. Together, they marched out to meet Timur in the open field on October 30th. This was, in retrospect, a catastrophic mistake. Timur had one weapon the Mamluks did not know how to counter: war elephants. He had brought some of the Indian elephants captured at Delhi north into Syria, and he now put them in the center of his line. His cavalry, in classic Timurid fashion, swept wide in arc-shaped formations around the Mamluk flanks. The Mamluks were caught between the elephants they could not break and the cavalry closing behind them. The Arab chronicler recorded what happened next in a phrase that has echoed for centuries. Then he went over them like a razor over hair and ran like locusts over a green crop. The Mamluk line broke within an hour. The survivors tried to reach the safety of Aleppo's gates. Timur had already positioned a reserve of 10,000 horsemen to catch them in the pursuit. They killed the Mamluks in the killing ground between the battlefield and the city gates. Aleppo's citadel held for a few days more, but it too surrendered by November 2nd. Then came the sack. In the sack of Aleppo in 1400 is where Timur's brutality descended to a level that even his own chroniclers found difficult to describe. His soldiers went house to house through Aleppo, killing men, taking women. The historian Ibn Tagrabirdi, writing from Egypt within a generation of the event, recorded that Timur's Tatar troops committed mass rape of Aleppo's women inside the mosques, in some cases forcing their fathers and brothers to watch before killing them. Children were murdered systematically. Then came the tower. Timur ordered around 20,000 severed heads collected and built into a great tower outside the city walls. This tower had a specific detail that made it different from earlier constructions. Timur ordered the heads placed with their faces turned deliberately outward. Every traveler approaching Aleppo would be met at eye level by 20,000 dead faces staring back at them. The Byzantine historian Dukas, who wrote about Timur's later siege of Smyrna, described the Aleppo tower in exactly these terms. The heads were positioned so that the eye sockets in their thousands faced the road. It was, chroniclers agreed, more horrifying than the earlier skull towers had been. Not because there were more heads, though there were plenty, but because of the deliberate choice to make the dead look at you. Aleppo had been one of the wealthiest cities of the medieval Islamic world, a center of trade between Persia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. Its glass, its textiles, and its metalwork had been famous from Cairo to Venice. When Timur left in early November 1400, marching south toward Hama and eventually Damascus, Aleppo was a ruin. Its craftsmen were being marched east to Samarkand, its warehouses were emptied, its walls were partially demolished. Its wells were poisoned or filled with bodies, and its dead faced outward from a tower at its gates, watching the road for anyone else who might be foolish enough to come and try to build here again. The Italian traveler Dominionelli, who saw Damascus after Timur left it, wrote about how the whole region of Syria never fully returned to its former glory. Aleppo was the beginning of that regional death. Its glass industry, the most sophisticated in the medieval world, simply disappeared. Within 50 years, Venetian workshops in Europe were making the enameled mosque lamps that Aleppo had once exported. That is what Timur did to a city, not just kill it. Take its economic knowledge and leave a tower of watching heads behind so that no one would remember how to make it again. Number 4, Damascus, 1401. If Aleppo showed what Timur did to a city that fought him, Damascus showed what he did to a city that tried to negotiate. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Nasir ad-Din Faraj, marched north from Cairo to face Timur outside Damascus in the winter of 1400. He had a large army. He had the great walls of Damascus behind him, and with him, brought along almost against his will, was one of the most brilliant minds in the medieval Islamic world. Ibn Khaldun, the historian who is now considered the founder of sociology and one of the greatest thinkers Islam ever produced, was 68 years old. He had been dragged from Cairo by the young sultan as part of the diplomatic delegation. Ibn Khaldun did not want to be there. He had told Sultan Faraj the campaign was a mistake. Timur's army was too strong, too mobile, too disciplined. Faraj went anyway. And then, when the campaign started to go badly, when Timur's cavalry began outmaneuvering the Mamluks in the fields west of Damascus, when news arrived that a rival was preparing to seize power in Cairo, Faraj simply abandoned his own army in Syria and rode home with his elite troops. He left Damascus to fight Timur alone. The city knew it was doomed. The great Qadis and religious scholars of Damascus tried to negotiate, and Ibn Khaldun, stranded in the city, and one of the most famous men in the Islamic world was chosen as their ambassador. Because the gates of Damascus had been closed for the siege, Ibn Khaldun could not leave through them. On a January morning in 1401, this 68-year-old philosopher, wrapped in his scholar's robes, was tied into a basket and lowered by ropes over the city walls. He climbed out of the basket in the field beyond and walked alone to the tent of the man who had just built a tower of watching heads at Aleppo. Ibn Khaldun stayed in Timur's camp for 7 weeks. He wrote about their conversations later in what has become one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval world. Timur was, in his own words, one of the greatest and mightiest of kings. Timur was fascinated by Ibn Khaldun. He asked him about the geography of North Africa, about the history of Islamic scholarship, about Ibn Khaldun's own theory of how civilizations rise and fall. He commissioned him to write a detailed report on the Maghreb. Ibn Khaldun described Timur as intelligent, curious, argumentative, capable of holding long conversations on subjects that most warlords would have dismissed. They talked history. They talked geography. They talked, according to Ibn Khaldun, about the Muqaddimah, the philosopher's masterwork on the cycles of civilization. And while they talked, Damascus burned. Timur's negotiations were only ever a stall. He was waiting for the city's elites to reveal where their wealth was hidden. When Ibn Khaldun eventually left, safely escorted back to Egypt at Timur's own arrangement, the sack began. On March 17, 1401, Timur unleashed his army on Damascus. The chroniclers describe scenes that passed the boundary of ordinary military brutality. Men were tortured to reveal where they had hidden their gold. The women of the city were rounded up in the Great Umayyad Mosque, one of the oldest surviving mosques in the world, built by the Caliph al-Walid in 715. The mosque had stood for nearly 700 years. It had survived earthquakes, sieges, and the sack of the Mongols in 1260. It did not survive Timur. His soldiers set it on fire while people were still sheltering inside. The wooden roof of the Great Prayer Hall, which had held for centuries, collapsed in a wall of flame onto thousands of civilians who had gone there believing that no one, not even a Turco-Mongol conqueror, would burn the Umayyad Mosque. Timur burned it. The western minaret, damaged in 1401, still bears the mark of Timur's fire in its stones today. Then came the field. Timur had chosen a site outside the northeastern corner of the city walls. Here, he ordered the survivors he had marked for execution to be brought and beheaded systematically. Thousands of heads were piled into a pyramid. That square, in the modern city of Damascus, is still called Burj al-Ruus, the Tower of Heads. The philosopher Ibn Khaldun, safely back in Cairo, wrote his account of the sack. Its bitterness leaks through every sentence. He had been played. The most famous mind of his generation, treated with elaborate respect, engaged in serious philosophical conversation, had been used as a delaying tactic, while the city he was supposed to save was systematically taken apart. He wrote later that Timur was capable of anything, that his mind was terrifying in its precision, and that his cruelty was not passion but strategy. Ibn Khaldun understood, in a way most of Timur's victims did not, that the massacres were not madness. They were policy. And when Ibn Khaldun returned to Cairo, he stopped writing. His autobiography, which had chronicled decades of his life, in detail ends within a page or two of his return from Damascus. Some historians think he simply could not put on paper what he had seen. Damascus. After Timur had 100,000 people slaughtered, its craftsmen deported to Samarkand, its great mosque burnt, and its glass industry, which had been the finest in the world, effectively extinguished. Its potters, its silk weavers, its calligraphers, all marched east. The city Ibn Khaldun visited had ceased to exist by the time he wrote about it. That is what Timur did to a city that tried to negotiate. Number 3, Baghdad, 1401. 143 years before Timur reached Baghdad, in 1258, the Mongol Hulagu Khan had sacked the city, executed the last Abbasid caliph, and butchered enough of Baghdad's population that the Tigris River was said to have run first red with blood and then black with the ink of the drowned libraries. It was one of the defining atrocities of the medieval world. Baghdad had spent 143 years slowly rebuilding its libraries, partially restored, its scholars returning its bazaars, operating again under the Jalayirid Sultanate. And then, in the summer of 1401, Timur arrived. It was 143 years later, and it was going to be worse. Timur had been to Baghdad before. He had taken it in 1393 without a massacre. But Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, the ruler of the city, was a slippery man. Every time Timur turned his back, Ahmad returned and reoccupied his capital. By 1401, Timur was done being patient. He arrived with an army and besieged Baghdad in the height of summer. The siege lasted 40 days. The heat was ferocious. Ahmad Jalayir fled the city before it fell, escaping to Ottoman territory. His garrison held out longer, fighting from the walls under a sun that killed unarmored men in a few hours. Then the walls came down. What followed was a massacre that, even by Timur's standards, was designed to shock. It was Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest festivals in the Islamic calendar. Timur celebrated the feast in a way that no one had ever done before. He ordered every soldier in his army, every single common trooper, to bring him a minimum of 2 severed heads by the end of the day. He set the quota deliberately high. His army numbered around 90,000. That meant a minimum of 180,000 heads had to be produced. And in a city Baghdad's size, in a single day, that meant killing everyone. Timur's soldiers hunted through Baghdad's streets. When they ran out of civilians in the poorer districts, they broke into the wealthy homes. When they ran out there, they hunted through the mosques and madrasas, which were the only buildings Timur had specifically ordered spared as structures, but not as sanctuaries. The final head count for the day was around 90,000. The chronicler Ibn Arab Shah, who had grown up under Timurid rule and who chronicled his ruler's actions with careful cold detail, recorded that the heads were then stacked into 120 towers arranged around the ruined city. 120 towers of skulls to mark the sack of Baghdad. Contemporary chronicles said only about 1 out of every 100 Baghdadis survived the massacre, and those survivors were mostly artisans, marched east into slavery. Then came the second death. Baghdad's greatness had always rested on the same foundation as Sistan's: water. The canal networks fed from the Tigris were what made the surrounding lands productive. They had been maintained continuously for over 1,000 years since the time of the Sassanids and before. Timur ordered them destroyed. Not damaged, not neglected, systematically broken. The dams that regulated the canals were pulled apart. The channels were filled with rubble. The engineering knowledge that maintained them was carried east with the enslaved craftsmen. Baghdad, which had been the center of a great agricultural civilization for over 1,000 years, effectively lost its agricultural base overnight. Historians who study the region argue that this deliberate destruction of the Tigris canal system did more permanent damage than the massacre itself. The population you can eventually replace. The engineering base of an entire river system, once lost, does not come back for centuries. Iraq did not fully recover until modern times. Baghdad did not recover its intellectual standing at all. The city that had once housed the House of Wisdom, that had translated the Greek philosophers into Arabic, and set European Renaissance scholars on the path to recovering their own tradition, went dark. It became a provincial town. Books that Hulagu Khan's Mongols had failed to destroy in 1258, Timur's soldiers finished off in 1401. The great libraries, patched and rebuilt over 143 years of slow work, burned again. And this time, no, one was going to rebuild them for a very long time. The horror at Baghdad was compounded by something almost impossible to communicate. Timur had done it as a celebration. He had chosen the holiest day of the Muslim calendar, a day meant to commemorate mercy and the sparing of Ismail from sacrifice, to order the largest single-day massacre of his career. His court chroniclers found this hard to justify even to a court that had already justified Isfahan and Delhi. The mullahs of Baghdad, some of whom Timur had ordered spared as scholars were forced to watch their city die and their canal networks broken while their conqueror hosted a religious celebration on the walls. That was the choice. That was the point. Timur was not Hulagu Khan. Hulagu had killed Baghdad because he did not care about it. Timur killed Baghdad because he wanted to make sure that no one in his lifetime or in any lifetime he could influence would think of Baghdad as a place worth being. 143 years after the first great sack, Timur wrote the epitaph. Number 2, Ankara, 1402. And now we come to the moment that everything before had been leading up to, whether Timur knew it or not, between 1400 and 1402. While Timur was breaking Syria and Baghdad, another empire was rising to the west that considered itself the natural successor to the world of Islam. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Bayezid I, called Yildirim, meaning the Thunderbolt had spent 14 years turning itself from a regional Anatolian power into the terror of Christendom. Bayezid had crushed the Crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396. He had all but encircled Constantinople and was preparing its final siege. He had absorbed dozens of the smaller Turkish beyliks of Anatolia, adding their manpower to his own. He and Timur were now the two most powerful men in the Islamic world, and they had been exchanging insulting letters for years, when Bayezid gave shelter to Sultan Ahmed Jalayir of Baghdad. The man Timur had chased out of his capital. The collision became unavoidable. Timur marched west in the spring of 1402. He captured Sivas on the way, and there, according to Christian chroniclers, he executed the mostly Armenian garrison by burying them alive. The number given by contemporary sources, 4,000 buried alive at Sivas, is one of the atrocities that Ibn Khaldun's fellow philosopher-historians would list alongside Zarange and Isfahan as the definitive marks of Timur's method. Bayezid the Thunderbolt was famous for the speed of his campaigns. He had earned his nickname by moving armies faster than any Ottoman before him. He fielded probably 85,000 men, including his elite Janissary Corps, his Serbian vassals under Stefan Lazarevic, and his Anatolian levies. He marched them fast toward Ankara, expecting to catch Timur besieging the city. Timur was not there. Timur, who understood Bayezid's psychology exactly, had lifted the siege of Ankara and moved his roughly 140,000-strong army in a great arc around Bayezid's forces, taking positions with better water and a rested army. Bayezid arrived at Ankara to find his enemy behind him on ground his enemy had chosen. His men were exhausted from a forced march. His water supply had been cut. Timur had personally overseen the damming of the local stream so that Bayezid's soldiers would have to fight in July heat without proper hydration. The battle happened on July 28, 1402, on the Subat plain outside Ankara. It was one of the most consequential single days of medieval Islamic history. Bayezid's Anatolian vassals, whose beyliks Timur had promised to restore, began defecting to Timur's side in the middle of the battle. His Serbian heavy cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic fought with extraordinary discipline, cutting through Timurid lines in a way that impressed even Timur's chroniclers, but they were only a fraction of the army. The Janissaries fought around Bayezid to the last man, and then, as the encirclement closed, it was over. Bayezid tried to escape. He was captured while trying to flee into the mountains east of the battlefield. He was 43 years old. He had been the most feared warrior in the Muslim world for a decade. He was taken to Timur's tent in chains. What happened next is one of the enduring stories of the medieval world. Later European chroniclers, especially Western Christian ones, claimed that Timur kept Bayezid in an iron cage as a movable prisoner, dragging him around the empire as a trophy. Modern historians tend to be more cautious. Some contemporary sources speak of a cage, others of a litter or a curtained conveyance. What is not in doubt is this. Bayezid the Thunderbolt died in captivity in March 1403, less than 8 months after his defeat. Some accounts say he took his own life in shame. Some say he died of a stroke. Some say he simply gave up. The greatest Ottoman sultan of his generation, the man who had made Christian Europe tremble, was dead in a Timurid tent within a year of being the second most powerful Muslim ruler on earth. Then came the aftermath. The Ottoman Empire, which had looked unstoppable in 1401, effectively collapsed. Bayezid's 4 sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, went to war with each other for the throne. This period, which lasted 11 years, from 1402 to 1413, is known as the Ottoman Interregnum, and it is one of the most chaotic periods in Ottoman history. Cities changed hands. Frontiers dissolved. The Anatolian Beyliks Bayezid had reasserted their independence. Constantinople, which had been perhaps months away from Ottoman siege in 1402, was suddenly reprieved. Timur had, without ever intending to, given the Byzantine Empire another 50 years of life. Constantinople would not finally fall until 1453, and it would take Bayezid's great-grandson Mehmed II to finish the job. Every historian who studies the fall of Constantinople acknowledges the same fact. If Timur had not destroyed the Ottoman army at Ankara in 1402, Constantinople would have fallen at least half a century earlier. The last remnant of the Roman Empire in the east survived because a Turco-Mongol conqueror, thousands of miles from the Bosphorus, decided he did not like the way Bayezid had written him a letter. Timur, having broken the Ottomans, was congratulated by the kings of France, England, and Castile, who saw him as an ally against the Turkish threat. He did not care about their alliances. He was already thinking about China. But before he left Anatolia, he had one last piece of business to attend to. There was a fortress on the Aegean coast that had annoyed him. It was small. It was Christian. And it was going to teach the last important lesson of Timur's career. Number 1, Smyrna, 1402. And so we come to it. The battle that puts Timur, in the final analysis, above every warlord in the medieval world for cold-blooded efficiency. Because Smyrna was not a battle Timur needed to fight. Smyrna, the modern Turkish city of Erzmir, was a coastal port and fortress that had been in Christian hands since 1344 when the Knights Hospitaller had captured it during one of the Crusades. The Knights held the harbor and the sea castle. The Turks held the inland citadel. For 58 years, this arrangement had persisted. The Knights Hospitaller, the great Crusader military order, had defended Smyrna against every Ottoman attack. Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt himself had tried and failed to take it. The Ottomans had never managed to break through the harbor defenses that the Hospitallers had built and maintained for 2 generations. Smyrna was Christendom's toehold on the Anatolian coast. It was, to the Ottomans, an embarrassment. Timur decided to remove it. He arrived in front of Smyrna on December 2nd, 1402, at the head of an army that had already broken the Ottomans and taken every city between Baghdad and the Aegean. Inside Smyrna was Inigo de Alfaro, castellan of the Hospitaller garrison, commanding around 200 knights and their auxiliaries, a small but famous force reinforced during the summer by additional knights under Bufilo Panizzati. Timur, following his standard practice, offered terms. If the knights converted to Islam and paid tribute, they could live. The Hospitallers, whose entire identity was built on defending Christendom against exactly this kind of demand, refused with contempt. And then Timur began his masterclass in siegecraft. The city had one strategic weakness. It could be supplied by sea. As long as the harbor stayed open, the Hospitallers could hold indefinitely, and Christian ships could bring in reinforcements. Timur solved this the way Timur solved everything. He turned to his army, which numbered in the tens of thousands, and ordered every single soldier, to pick up a stone and throw it into the mouth of the harbor. The Byzantine historian Duca's records this order was something between horror and awe. Tens of thousands of stones hurled into the harbor entrance in a single frantic day. The harbor was blocked. No Christian ship could enter or leave. The Hospitallers, who had spent 60 years relying on the sea for their survival, suddenly found themselves besieged by land and cut off by land. Then came the siege engines. Timur built stone-throwing artillery, catapults on wheels, mining equipment. He had studied the great sieges of the Islamic world. He had also, in a detail that shocked contemporary observers, brought war elephants all the way to the Aegean coast, animals from India that had marched through Persia, Iraq, Syria, Anatolia, and now stood on the shores of the Aegean. He worked his miners under the walls. His catapults reduced the towers. On or around December 15th, 1402, roughly 2 weeks after the siege had begun, his miners collapsed a section of the wall in a single explosion, burying many of the defenders in the rubble. The Hospitallers rallied and fought in the courtyard against Timurid troops pouring through the breach. It was, in the words of the chroniclers, the last stand of Christendom on the Anatolian mainland. The knights fought in disciplined ranks. They killed many. But there were only 200 of them, and Timur had sent an army, Inigo de Alfaro, and some of his knights managed to reach their galleys in the partially blocked harbor and escaped. Most of the defenders and almost all of the city's Christian population did not. And then Timur did the thing that even by his standards was theatrically monstrous. A relief fleet from Rhodes and other Christian holdings had been sailing to reinforce Smyrna. They arrived in the harbor days after the city had fallen. They saw Timur's forces controlling the walls. They also saw something that made them turn around without landing. Timur, having taken the city, had ordered his men to catapult the severed heads of the Christian defenders into the sea in front of the arriving fleet, and to launch some of them at the ships themselves. The Christian captains, watching the heads of men they had come to save being flung at them, understood exactly what Timur was telling them. This place is now his, and there is no one to save. They turned around and sailed back to Rhodes. Smyrna, the great Crusader fortress that the Ottoman Empire had failed to take in decades of trying, had been taken by Timur in about 2 weeks. He then ordered the sea castle demolished, the walls torn down, and the great harbor works dismantled. He would not stay. He did not want the city. He simply did not want it to exist as a Christian stronghold, and he did not want anyone else to think a fortress could be built on that coast that could resist him. When he left, Smyrna was rubble, and the Byzantine historian Ducas recorded that the Tower of Skulls Timur built outside its walls in the same style as Aleppo faced the same way, faces turned outward toward the sea. That was the last great siege of Timur's career. He would live 3 more years. He would begin planning an invasion of Ming China, gathering an army of hundreds of thousands and marching them through the winter toward the eastern frontier. He would die on February 18th, 1405, at the age of 69 of an illness in his tent at Otrar in modern Kazakhstan, before ever crossing the border into China. His empire would begin coming apart within a generation. His descendants would eventually produce Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire in India, whose ancestors would remember Timur as a source of pride, even as most of the world remembered him as a source of horror. But the numbers stayed on the ground. Roughly 17 million dead across 35 years of conquest, 5% of the world's population at the time. 28 towers at Isfahan, 120 towers at Baghdad, 20,000 heads at Aleppo, 90,000 heads at Baghdad, 100,000 prisoners killed in a single afternoon at Delhi, 2,000 men cemented alive at Zarange. The great Crusader fortress at Smyrna reduced in 2 weeks. Constantinople accidentally spared for 50 more years by the destruction of the Ottoman army at Ankara. Ibn Khaldun lowered in a basket over the walls of Damascus to negotiate with a man who was going to burn the Umayyad mosque anyway. And through it all, one pattern. Timur was not a chaotic killer. Timur was, in his own terrifying way, a systematic one. He picked his examples deliberately. He built his towers on the roads. He killed in a way calculated to be remembered. And that is what makes him, in the end, more brutal than Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan destroyed cities because they resisted or because he needed them out of the way. His atrocities were huge, but often opportunistic. Timur's atrocities were architectural. They were policy. They were, in a sense, we still struggle to describe, works of grim design. He was the only warlord in history who turned severed heads into a coherent visual language of terror, one that could be read the same way in Persia, in India, in Syria, in Iraq, in Anatolia, and on the shores of the Aegean. His skull towers were a message written in bone, and the message was always the same. This is what happens, this is what always happens, and do not think, because you are far away, that I cannot reach you. Because I can. Kondurcha proved that. Isfahan proved that. Ankara proved that. And Smyrna, at the very edge of the Christian world, was the final signature at the bottom of the page. There would not be another conqueror like him. Whether that is because history refused to produce one, or because his 17 million dead exhausted the world's capacity for such men. Historians still argue. But Timur's own descendants, when they built the Mughal Empire in India a century later, chose to build it around law, art, and administration rather than skull towers. Even they, who honored him, did not want to become him. If this look at the darker side of the Mongol legacy and its most horrifying inheritor made you see medieval history a little differently, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to show this to more history fans who deserve the real story of what happened in the century after Genghis Khan. Subscribe for more deep dives into the battles and figures your school textbooks left out. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Drop a comment right now. Tell us which of Timur's massacres you had never heard of before. Tell us where you're watching from. Our community is spread across the world, and every voice adds something. Thank you for watching. History should not forget what one man did between 1383 and 1405, and if you keep telling these stories, it won't. If you want to see how the original Mongol horde under Genghis Khan and his grandsons set the stage for everything Timur later did, check out our video on the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258. The atrocity Timur would return to finish 143 years later.